Brenda Croeso, thank you for joining us for our latest Cydrannu webinar as part of the Cydrannu Knowledge Sharing series. I'm Corey Hughes and I'm part of the delivery team for Cyd. So since we last saw you, the Cyd team have been out and about this last month. Highlight obviously being Procure X just over a week ago. Great for us to meet so many of the community who have driven the design of the Cyd service in person. And congratulations to all of the finalists, winners, and highly commended at the Go Awards. It's always nice to be recognised, isn't it, for good work? So we did take home a highly commended for collaborative procurement initiative. Congratulations to the winners of that award, our colleagues in procurement and reform at Welsh Government in collaboration with Cabinet Office and UK Government. So back to today's session, we are recording this Cydrannu as usual so that we can share it on our website and allow as many people as possible to access the content. If you are feeling a little bit camera shy and you're out there, then this is your cue to just turn your camera off because this will be, as I said, shared on the Cyd site later. So firstly, we'll be hearing from our guest speakers, and then we will make plenty of time for questions, discussion and debate at the end of the presentations. Please feel free as we go through the talks today to add any questions you have to the Q&A or the chat, and we will make sure that we pick them up from there. You can also ask questions as our speakers are going through their presentations. There's going to be a lot of information today, a lot of really interesting discussion about data. If you need anything explained in terms of glossaries of descriptions of things, then we are happy to facilitate that too. So if you've got any technical issues, they do sometimes happen, then my colleague Sumi, who is behind the red dragon on your screen, is supporting us today, and she'll do her best to help you. Again, you can message Sumi directly in the chat, and she'll keep an eye on the Q&A functions too. So before I introduce more about today's session, I would like to ask my colleague Emma to say a few words about the Welsh language support available today. So Emma, over to you.
So mae croeso i unrhyw un i ofyn cwestiwn trwy'r Gymraeg os ych chi eisiau, a na i ymateb neu cyfieithu ar gyfer y panel.
Diolch, Emma. So for today's session, we are joined by Dr. Jen Harris from the Open Data Services Cooperative and Sean Ellis-Williams from My Society. So Jen and Sean are going to be talking about delivering wellbeing impact for people and planet by using open data standards. And this really ties into our ethos at Cyd, which is all about digital experimentation and cross-sector collaboration. I won't say any more, but I am really excited to welcome both speakers. I think there's going to be a lot of things that we can talk about when we have heard both speakers go through their presentations, and we are excited to get stuck in. So let's get started, and I will hand over to Jen. Croeso, Jen, I'm just going to stop sharing and let you take the reins.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. So let me just share my own screen. Which one is it? Oh, is it that one? Yes. Okay, hopefully you should all be able to see some slides now. I could see a thumbs up, Sean. Brilliant. All right, so thank you for having me. My name is Jen Harris. I work for Open Data Services. So I'm just going to talk to you today a bit about open data standards and in particular disaster risk reduction and how they work with that. So just quick introduction. So I'm from Open Data Services Cooperative. As the name would suggest, we are a workers' cooperative, and our core business is in researching, building, maintaining and promoting open data standards. So I've listed a few on this slide here that we have worked with over the years. So we're small, there's almost 30 of us now, and we're mostly based in the UK. We're a team made up of policy researchers, data analysts and software developers. So I've been with the ODS for almost exactly 2 years now, and I work primarily with the open contracting and the open contracting for infrastructure data standards. So the first of those, some of you may already be familiar with, because the UK government, the Welsh government and the Scottish government have all adopted it for publishing their procurement data. And they've been doing that for, all of them have been doing that for at least a year. But about a year ago, I got a chance to work with something a bit different in the form of the risk data library standard, which is what I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes or so. So first of all, I'm going to explain what a data standard actually is, why we think it's important, and then give you an example of one in the form of this risk data library standard, and then come back to why, as procurement professionals, you should be aware and hopefully care about these things. So first, my quick explanation of what a data standard is, for those of you who don't already know. So essentially, data standards are just rules for describing and recording data. So the idea is that if you've got a standard, if you've got an agreed upon set of rules and formats, it removes any ambiguity and then helps both the systems and the people who are going to be interacting with the data work out exactly what the data means, so that they're not having to waste lots of time on interpretation. So to give you an example of what I mean by this, we can look at time. Time is always a good one to look at. So on this slide here, we've got a map of the world and all the countries coloured differently. And these different colours are different time formats that these places use. Well, date, really. So in the green, we've got most of Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, who tend to write the date as day, month, and then year. We've got the USA in red on its own, which does month, then day, then year. China, Canada, and a few others in yellow, who tend to do year, month, day. And then there's other countries which use even different ones, sometimes month, day, year. So unless you know exactly where you are and what standard is being used, you don't necessarily know what the date I've got on the bottom of the slide here means. Is that the 1st of October 2012, or maybe it's the 10th of January 2012, or maybe it's even the 12th of October 2001. So we need a standard way of dealing with these things. So with date time, there is an international standard for describing it, and it goes with the yellow countries here, which basically says start with the longest and work your way down. So year, month, day, hour, minute, second. So this is why it is useful to have these sorts of standards. So now we know what a data standard is, but what do we mean when we say an open data standard? So open data standards are ones that are made available to the general public for free, but also they are maintained and developed in a collaborative and open way. So the people who are going to be using them have the opportunity to actually feed into the development of these standards. So it's not just that they're available to read and implement, but that the process itself is open as well. And in this way, hopefully, the people who know all about whatever the standard is trying to describe are going to be the ones who get a chance to have a say in it. So why are they important? So first of all, data standards, they allow for data exchange between systems. So you can pull in data from one system, put it into another straight away if you don't need to be transforming it from one format to another. It allows you to aggregate data in that you can take data from two different sources. And if they've both used the same data standard, you can just pull them straight together, again, without needing to do any sort of tricky conversions. Because you can do this, and because the standard itself is open, with open standards, it also allows for building more tools for analysing the data, which again just opens up what you can do with any data that might be around. So this allows you to do potentially much more powerful analysis of data that is available. And this helps give it a policy focus as well. So it's not just about, oh, we've got some data, it's nice to have data, because some data nerds are just like that. But it's about actually being able to use it to do something for policy. So you can make it policy focused, and it can be part of a sort of a broader scheme of things. So I mentioned the open contracting data standard earlier. So that was developed mostly by the Open Contracting Partnership, who use it as part of a broader toolkit to encourage policymakers around the world to adopt it, and as part of their general increasing transparency of public procurement. And so in that way, data standards can have a real impact on both the social world. So on to my example with risk data. So between 2009 and 2019, there was around 2 billion people across the world affected by some form of natural disaster. So with the climate crisis, the regularity and severity of at least some of these disasters is sadly only on the increase. So it's in everyone's interests, both the general public, but also governments, multinational companies, humanitarian NGOs, everyone's interest to not only try and predict these events, but also to model them to work out what exactly the impacts of them might be. And therefore, maybe we could mitigate against the worst of some of these. So a major tool that is used for this are things called CAT models. So the CAT is just catastrophe. These originated in the reinsurance industry, who needed to know the cost of fixing or compensating their customers after some sort of natural disaster, so that they could then work out how much they should be charging them for their insurance coverage. But these have spread out to other users who've also realised that they also need to know these things. So national governments, academics, etc., who are interested in using these models to estimate and then prepare for and minimise potential damage and loss from major disasters. So they're a well understood and very mature tool, but because they've come out of the insurance industry, most of them are proprietary. And then even though there are now open source ones, they do have this sort of key limitation to using them, which you have with any sort of tool, which is in that you need the right data to put in them, and it needs to be good quality. Now, a particular problem with a CAT model is that it involves 4 different data types, as I've got up on this slide. So you've got hazard, exposure, vulnerability, they all feed into the model, and then you can work out your loss and damage data. Just quickly, so a quick explanation of what I mean by these. So hazard data is sort of what the hazard actually is. So if we consider a flood, so the hazard data would be where does the river flow when it floods? Where does the flood water tend to go? How deep does it tend to be? That sort of thing. Then you've got the exposure, which is on or right next to the river on the floodplain. What is there? Is it farmland? Is it housing? That sort of thing. And then with vulnerability, again, using that same example, the vulnerability would be if it's housing, what sort of housing is it? Is it low-level sheltered housing, which has a lot of vulnerable infirm older people in it, or maybe it's high-level tower blocks where the ground floor is a car park, so even if it floods a bit, it's not going to do that much damage. And then you can work out what the loss is. So each of these different data sets, they tend to be collected by different agencies for different purposes, and therefore they often have different spatial, temporal scales, that sort of thing. So that makes it difficult, because if you're trying to combine data sets, the first thing you need to do is find your data. But if they've been collected by different people, then they're going to be spread about over different databases with different owners who you need to speak to and might have different licensing conditions, that sort of thing. And then even if you find the data, you need to make sure it's comparable. So you need to make sure that you can actually combine it. So for example, is it covering the same time period, or is it actually from different ones? So this is where the Risk Data Library Standard came in. So a few years ago, the World Bank's Global Facility for Disaster Risk Recovery started to create a catalogue of risk data that could go in to CAT models. But they found, so that was solving the first problem. They gathered it all into one place. But then they found that even in one place, they still had the second problem, the checking that everything was compatible. So to help solve this, they came up with their Risk Data Library Standard. So the Risk Data Library Standard is used to describe those 4 components that I mentioned. So the risk, the exposure, the vulnerability, and then the modeled loss and damage. And the World Bank Group, they're all the experts in this sort of stuff. And so they'd managed to come up with a first draft where they'd separated out common elements in each data type. So they all, for example, will have a date or time associated with them and a location, and put together some rules about common elements there and how they should be described and formatted. And they'd done the same with elements that are specific. So that, you know, which are the common things that a hazard data set should always mention, for example. And this was absolutely the sort of thing that they needed to do because they're experts in the domain. But it wasn't necessarily the most robust or user-friendly standard at that point. which was where they came in to us. So we worked alongside this team at the World Bank, and we were able to use our own expertise in data standards that we've developed from years of helping other people put together their data standards to ensure that it was coherent and consistent, both internally, so like the data set itself was consistent across different bits within it, and also with other relevant international open data standards that exist, so such as the ISO date and time standard that I mentioned earlier. We updated all their documentation for them to ensure that it was clear, accurate, and easy to understand. And we developed some open source tools as well, so just to help people create their own data sets using this data standard. So some of this stuff can almost seem a little nitpicky, but you can make a data standard if you want, but unless it's easy for people to find and understand, no one's going to use it, and then it's not actually going to be serving its purpose. So hopefully this will have made it easier to use and will increase its use. So it should be getting officially launched very soon. I can't remember the exact date. But why, as procurement professionals, would you all care about this? I don't expect anyone here is likely to ever be actually running their own CAT model themselves, but it does have relevance to the world of procurement, which is why I thought it was important to talk about. So climate and disaster risk modelling, it's already going to be used across the world in various places to influence policy decisions that then lead on to procurement decisions. And the UK is sadly becoming increasingly susceptible to disaster risk as extreme weather becomes more and more common. So if we take an obvious example, we can take the last month or so, we've had, what is it, Babette and Kieran of the big storms, I think that's the names. And there's been a lot of flooding all across the UK. There's certainly a lot in Scotland where I am, and I know there was quite a bit in Wales as well. And there has been a stark contrast in the outcomes of the towns and locations which have got good flood defences that were then properly implemented during the floods, and the places that don't. And obviously there's a cost to build a flood defence, but it's also a cost to not build the flood defence. And the people in charge of making these decisions, they need to have the best information available on what the costs of not doing something are, as well as the costs of what doing something are. And this is where results from things like these CAT models can provide this information. So it will lead into why procurement decisions potentially get made. And on a more general note, why would you care about data standards? So ultimately, a data standard is about making everyone who works with data's life easier. So whether you're producing data, if you've got a standard, it's hopefully easier to produce, so you can produce more of it, or you can just produce better quality data. Or if you're using the data, again, hopefully you'll either have more of it now, or it'll be better quality, or you'll just be able to understand it easier. More data, more better quality means you can hopefully do better analysis with it, get a bit more information about it, and then you can use that to really make and measure change in the real world. And you can actually have some real world impacts, even though it is, in some ways, it's just tables of numbers, but it can have this real world impact. And I believe Sean is going to talk about some examples of real world impacts that my society have been doing. So I will pass over to you, Sean, and stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, it's such impressive and important work, I think. I feel sometimes that adaptation is the kind of neglected side of the coin with climate. And it just feels like it's getting more and more critical, really, to sort of address that imbalance, and you know, just phenomenal work to make that easier. Right, I'll bring up my slides. Warn everybody that I'm going to whiz through a fairly long slide deck, and do just shout if something isn't clear. Really happy to kind of clarify stuff as I go. But I'll start by saying Pnawn da, good afternoon. Hello everyone, I'm Sean. I'm the Outreach and Networks Coordinator for my society's climate programme. And our climate programme does this, essentially. We build civic technology, so that's kind of technology that supports democracy for a faster, fairer climate response. And in the next 10-15 minutes, probably more towards 15 minutes, I'll try to tell you a bit about who my society is and our commercial arm society works, I'll give you an overview of our climate programme, and we'll have a bit of a focus on some prototyping weeks that we ran last year, and something that came out of those related to procurement called Contract Countdown. So what is My Society and Society Works? So My Society is best known for some of the big digital services that we've been running for years. And so you might be more familiar with these than you are with My Society, but we run Right to Them, Fix My Street, What Do They Know, and They Work for You. They're the really big ones. And these are some of the organizations we've kind of worked with on some of these. This is what they look like. And you can see there's a sort of sense of how many people use these annually to try and support their work. I'll just whip through some examples of the sorts of things people use them for, so you get a feel for what they actually do. So Fix My Street is helping people to report local issues, classically potholes, but a range of issues, and essentially it takes the pain out of needing to know who is responsible for dealing with different issues. It just routes your request to the people responsible. So yeah, getting stuff like this sorted. They Work for You is a way of keeping track of your MP's activities in Parliament. And lots of organisations kind of use this as a relatively affordable, well, free essentially, way of keeping track of what's going on. As you can see, there's prison reform groups using it there to good effect. Right to Them then helps you contact your elected representatives by email. So you can just pop your postcode in and it'll show you all your different elected representatives at each level of governance in the UK. And yeah, can use that to engage with your elected representatives. And What Do They Know is our freedom of information platform. So making it easy to make freedom of information requests, but also kind of publishing the results of those requests. So you might be able to find out that it's not even necessary for you to do one if somebody's already done it, and hopefully just letting information flow a bit more freely like that. So interesting example here of figuring out which CCTV has been manufactured using Chinese companies. And this is the international version of that. So everything we do is open by default. All the code and the data we publish, we try to do openly. And so the software that runs What Do They Know is actually used in about 20 or so other countries, and it's called Alavatali. So yeah, a use there of uncovering some financial corruption. And we've actually very recently brought in the Senedd to They Work for You. So I thought as a Welsh audience, you might be interested to know that you can keep track of Senedd members now as well. And that site's in Welsh and English, as you'd hope. Quick thing on our commercial arm. So Society Works, basically all of the revenues from Society Works flow back into My Society, back into the charity. And this is what Society Works does essentially, is to provide enhanced versions of some of our services to public bodies and help them to kind of integrate those into their existing systems. Here are some of the clients, so quite a few local authorities. Here are the sorts of services that we've developed. So Fix My Street Pro, so those local issues that people might be reporting by paying for a pro account, we can kind of plumb the software into the back end systems and it just flows a lot more easily, and makes it cheaper essentially for lots of bodies to respond to those. Freedom of information, waste, applications, and we do product and service discovery with clients as well. Just case studies on the site if you're interested to read a bit more about how that works. So one on how Fix My Street Pro is used by Transport for London. And we've just very recently also worked with some partners there in Wales to get Fix My Street into Welsh as well. So on to climate, which is what I work on. We it's quite a new thing for my society. In the last couple of years, there was a realization, I think, when there's a big spike in interest in climate around 2018, 2019, colleagues were really keen to explore the links, how climate and democracy are intertwined, and why, therefore, my society should be getting involved, and how it might do that. And we've got the local problem everywhere part of this is in our theory of change. We really see local authorities as being in the vanguard of the climate response, kind of whether they like it or not. You know, that's where a lot of pressure was directed to make emergency declarations and to come up with climate action plans, even in the absence of lots of kind of national support and frameworks within which to do that, and without many of the powers that I'm sure many local authorities would welcome. So we've taken, I think, the Committee on Climate Change estimate that about a third of emissions are in one way or another within the influence of local authorities, at least in theory. And so we felt like we could play a role here in trying to enable their ambitions to be met, and maybe to help raise ambitions where that was needed. So we do that through data and digital services like the ones that I've shown you. And we want a faster, fairer response. And essentially want that to be really collaborative and constructive, all the different actors who might be able to play a part, making it easier for them to do that. These are some of the services that are launched, and one that is launching in the new year. So the first one that we launched is the Climate Action Plan Explorer. This is a database of all local authority climate action plans that we can get our hands on that are public in the UK. And it's actually kind of developed from that with a few more layers of context to help people make sense of these plans, and to be able to do. I think one of the things I really like is that you can kind of compare to local authorities that are similar in some way to your own. So we can show you kind of the 10 most similar local authorities to yours based on things like indices of multiple deprivation, the emissions profile of the area, and the kind of mix between urban and rural space. And so hopefully you can find climate action plans that are kind of more relevant to you, and you can then just search within those. And we've added things like semantic search recently, so you can get to the bottom of what's lurking in these plans. And adaptation, I think, is like a really interesting example of that. We've been able to sort of say adaptation might be called a number of different things in these plans, but we've kind of tagged them, and you can see exactly where that pops up. So for places that are vulnerable to flooding, for instance, you can sort of learn. Local authorities are better able to learn from each other. That's the theory, at least. Moving on to scorecards, this is going a step further, and both of these services were developed in partnership with Climate Emergency UK. They were already starting to gather emergency declarations and so forth, and we felt we could help them do that more systematically with the sort of technology that we build. So this site kind of assesses, the version 1 just assessed climate action plans against a 50-point checklist. And hundreds of Climate Emergency UK volunteers kind of did that legwork. And this website helps you to kind of slice that data and view patterns in different ways. And the version 2 that launched very recently goes a step further and looks at kind of local indicators of progress as well. So it's not just looking at plans, but can we see sort of signs of action in different places? And some patterns immediately jump out, as you might expect. Some categories, there's a lot of room for improvement in particular categories across the board, and so that helps I think generate questions about why is progress not happening, what might be holding that back, what could actors at other levels of government be doing to support local authorities. Just some quick examples. There are many more of these on the website, how organisations have used Climate Action Plan Explorer to sort of see whether local authorities are serving low carbon meals, and another one where the scorecards has been used in kind of political engagement. But yeah, on to the prototyping weeks, and these were a way for us to quickly understand whether we might have a role to play in some other domains. Once we'd launched those first 2 services, we wanted to kind of dip our toe into a few others and quickly understand, by involving people from outside of my society who are more sort of steeped in those domains, what the problems are, what some potential solutions might look like, the kind that we would be able to work on. And then we would kind of very quickly build those into a basic website that didn't really work, but was enough to kind of test with people during the week and get some feedback and understand, should we take this further? Yeah, as you can see, it's that kind of thing. It was all done online, but there was lots of post-it notes and fleshing out people's thoughts and sort of different workshops and approaches to stimulating people's imaginations. Then we would kind of narrow down some of the more kind of promising ideas, figure out where there was some energy, and then start to try and map out how they could be developed and how they might support as well what already exists. So you can see some of the kind of open contracting data standard popping up in one of the post-its there on the left, and kind of how that connects to other things. Then we'd sort of storyboard, like, who is this for? How might they use it? What are they trying to do? How does that all fit together? And some of the things that we've taken on from those prototyping weeks, this is the local intelligence hub that you might have glimpsed earlier. It's basically a kind of a data exploration tool for that we're working with the Climate Coalition on, that helps spot kind of patterns across the UK. So you can see here, you can actually, for members of the Climate Coalition, they have access to some data that they've shared between themselves, but also you've got stuff in here like the number of households in fuel poverty. So you can just quickly run analyses and see, okay, where might there be opportunities to focus effort. And also at a local level, for different local actors to be able to find each other and kind of spot opportunities for collaboration. Lots of the members of the coalition, for instance, have kind of physical assets in places, and their coalition colleagues might be able to work with them to run events, that kind of thing. This is something I'm working on a lot at the moment. It's called Neighbourhood Warmth, and it's essentially a website that encourages community-led home energy action. So helping neighbours get together and try to navigate what can be a very overwhelming world of figuring out how to try and make your house a bit warmer and use less energy and so forth. But this is the one I wanted to focus on. So Contract Countdown, it was the very first week we ran because it felt like there was a lot of activity around kind of public procurement as a lever for climate action, with things like community wealth building approaches. So we wondered whether we could kind of get hold of some data on kind of contracts that were coming towards the end of their lives, and make it easier for people to sort of spot that. So the kinds of actors we had in mind initially were like local journalists or maybe local activists who might want to kind of influence the way that something is procured in future, or maybe, suggest that it shouldn't be procured, and like a radically different approach to something might be worthwhile. And so we did that by postcode search would kind of bring up a list of the contracts that we knew about for that local authority, and then you could kind of filter it down by category, or you could kind of look at how long was left on the contract. And these are the sorts of things that we came up with. And these question marks around estimated emissions and social value, we were inspired by some work that Spend Network did, which was doing ballpark estimations of the kind of carbon footprint of different kinds of contract. And social value was something that we could see there was a lot of interest and activity around that we thought might be interesting to bring in. Gave you a bit more detail here. And then we suggested some actions that could be taken, like submit a freedom of information request to find out more about that, maybe to find out whether any social value was kind of included in that, and engage with your elected representatives to find out what the plan is when this comes to the end of life. And then, sorry, down the bottom there, just some case studies. So we tested it with a bunch of people, some council officers included, and actually that's where we started to discover that there was interest from council officers in something like this. For certain council officers, it seemed, particularly those maybe in bigger councils, to sort of figure out what's going on. And yeah, we were getting people's impressions. Most people kind of grasped what we were trying to do with this. Their first impressions were pretty accurate. We found some really interesting examples of kind of innovative, purpose-driven procurement from other parts of the world, and some in the UK as well. And there was that was something that was really welcomed. Just being able to kind of give a case study, really helpful way to influence actors within the local authority. And yeah, just some other feedback on who would find it useful. This is more to do with the interface. People, future iterations would be a bit more visual, I think, to help people really get to grips with kind of all the information that is being presented to them. And some of the challenges, yes, you can see kind of adaptation. Some of these contracts obviously have really long lock-ins. So waste in particular, we spoke to the UK without incineration network later on, and I think that was one of the ones that sprang to mind for me, is living in Cardiff where there is an incinerator and it's got a long lifetime on it. I would love to have known earlier on, whether that was something that I could have some influence on. Social value, we never really got beyond scratching the surface of it, but felt like it could be worth exploring further, and how this might help sort of small to medium-sized enterprises engage on a more level playing field, who might not be able to afford kind of proprietary software to keep track of some of this stuff. Email alerts were an idea we use in our other services, so that people can be reminded that an opportunity might be coming up. So you could kind of do that every 6 months, just get a kind of a summary of what's changed. And yeah, these calls to action, people were generally supportive of. I think there's not a lot more to go into here, just people making the observation that different contracts are different lengths, and so there's not really a one size fits all here. And yeah, different ways of kind of ordering the data by cost, emissions, duration, suggestions of extra categories that would be useful. All of that summed up in a research report that we wrote after the prototyping week. The final thing I'll say is that we did go a step further in building this into a more functional website that actually used real data, and a lot of that was thanks to Jen and her colleagues, Open Data Services Co-op, guiding us towards where to get hands on real data and kind of bring that in, and that was really fun. So we tested that a bit more, and we didn't take it. It went back on the back burner after that, even though we'd had some encouraging feedback. Two reasons, really, I think. One was there seemed to be so much flux in the policy landscape around procurement in different parts of the UK and the UK as a whole, and digitalization being an important part of that. We felt that we were risking kind of building something that would be immediately out of date. And then that kind of mixed feedback we had from local authorities. Some local authorities said, the climate officer sat next to the people running the procurement, and they said, well, we just have a chat every day about what's coming up. It's not a problem for me. Whereas others, what somebody in one of the London boroughs really interested in community wealth building said, this would really help me to kind of keep track of all the stuff that's swirling around. But it didn't feel like we had a rock solid kind of need for this. But anyway, we may well pull it back off the back burner and revisit it now the dust is settling on some of that legislation. Just a big shout out to Open Data Services, and obviously these slides I'm happy to share. These are some of the actors we engaged with through this work. Some really interesting projects out there, and yeah, essentially we're just really interested to know if we can help. So do give us a shout if there's anything that you feel we can help with. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Diolch to you both. Whilst you stop sharing there, Sean, I will just check in the chat and Q&A if we have any questions popping up. Nothing at the moment, but this is the section of the Cydrannu where we will open the floor to some Q&A. I think I might jump in first, if I may, with some reflections from both of your presentations and the loop that you were both describing as you talked around data, which influences policy, which influences procurement, which generates data, which then goes back around that loop. And one of the things that you were both talking about is how important the quality of data is, you know, the right data going in so that we can make the right decisions. Now, to what extent do you both feel that digital skills play a part in that ability to generate the right data? And I say that because certainly for us at Cyd, we are conscious of developing services that are both offline and online, but we do have a conscious need to make transparent the kind of workings of a system that is reliant on, like you say, conversations, but also data that is being created by lots of different professionals, sometimes in lots of different ways. So I just wanted to make that connection, I suppose, and any of the challenges or wins that you have seen as you've been advocating that open use of data in procurement, but also beyond. So I'll throw that question out to both of you, and then I'll open it to the floor.
Mind if I go first, Sean? Cool. Yeah, so I think digital skills are definitely important. But I think possibly what's more important is what I would call digital literacy. So knowing how to use tools, knowing how to create a data set, that's useful, but I don't think everybody necessarily needs to know that. What everybody does need to have an understanding of is how to sort of judge, is this data set a good data set? Is it actually going to be useful for me? And you don't need to know specific bits of software. It doesn't matter how good you are with Excel. You should still, if a data set has been produced in a high quality way, you should still have enough information there that you can judge, okay, is this actually going to contain the information I need? And then if you decide it does, then you can say, brilliant, I'm going to go and speak to one of my analysts and they can give me help with more of the actual digital, more of the nitty-gritty technical stuff. So I think that's the really important thing. And I think that's also concentrating on that maybe helps take away a bit of the sort of fear some people sometimes have around, you say digital, and some people sort of shy away from it, a bit like when you're at school and you say maths to some people and they're like, oh no, maths. So I think if you sort of focus on it's more of a literacy point of view than almost digital. I think that can really help.
Thank you, Jen. Sean, can I bring you into that?
Yeah, thanks. I would agree with all of that. And I guess I'm thinking of our services often try to kind of hide the horror, if you like. So we try to make it a really easy user experience for most people to kind of engage with systems that might not be very human-centered. And some of that is just kind of legacy, and the digital revolution is kind of like sweeping through the world, but not everything changes at the same speed. So I guess for most of our users, we're trying to provide the relevant data at the right time, helping them kind of choose their own adventure in a way. On the one thing I guess really attracted me personally to procurement as a topic for one of our prototyping weeks was the idea of participation, and that democracy is much more than voting every few years. There are probably all sorts of ways in which people could engage democratically if they're invited to and supported to do so. And public money, I think it's fascinating really that like public money is spent maybe without that much participation, and maybe the rationale for that is that people have been elected and we've kind of delegated to them and they deal with it, and I'm not interested, frankly. But I think there's the kind of importance of data has really come through, I think, in our work with climate action plans. The importance of transparency of data is that it enables everybody to be able to kind of engage if they want to. It's a kind of a necessity for information to be available for you to be able to kind of form opinions and be an active citizen and participant in democracy. So yeah, I think that's been an interesting exchange that we've had with some public bodies, where they've said, well, why do we need to publish that? Because we're just cracking on and doing it, and this is kind of creating additional work. And our point is, you can't do it all on your own. If you make the data available, if you publish it, so it's kind of a cultural thing, I think, then you're actually enabling loads of other people to get involved and help you do it. But I think there's some real subtleties around that as well, just in terms of relationships between different layers of government, and some of the kind of disincentives to doing that, which I think are beyond the control of some public authorities.
Thank you both for letting me get the first question in there. Appreciate it. I can see, Warren, you have your hand up, so I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Corey, and thanks, Jen, and thanks, Sean. I think that was fascinating. I think I just want to pick up on Sean's kind of final point there and just work backwards a little bit, because I think you're absolutely right that unless there is engagement that's facilitated by procurement and commercial with the communities that governments at any level are there to serve, how can we possibly know what areas where perhaps public services are falling short of meeting the needs of those communities? And I think that can help identify where there might be a need for data to then inform how those services could be improved. And I think that I'm glad you said like participation and like deliberative approaches. It has to be genuine engagement rather than quite often we see sort of the theatre of engagement. It's more broadcast than actually a conversation. And I think it's vital that because public procurement globally, I mean, it's massive amounts of money. You've both referenced Open Contracting Partnership and Spend Network several times, but they published a report not so long ago, which estimated that globally governments spend about $13 trillion every year on goods, services, and works, but less than 3% of that is published openly. So there's a massive gap of transparency, and I love the contract countdown. I think there's a really interesting piece that links to the participation and deliberation. It's absolutely vitally needed at the pre-procurement stage, where if you can see that a contract is due to expire within the next 12 months, but you haven't yet seen any early market engagement for the replacement or future, then I as an active citizen, I'd be wanting to say, well, hold a minute, why aren't you engaging on this future contract? Surely there's an opportunity there to encourage greater conversations to happen way before the procurement actually starts to take place. And I think there's also an opportunity to use some of in the UK context, the new transparency notices, the pipeline transparency notices in advance of procurement, to actually help to identify areas where there might be some opportunities for improvement of transparency at that vital stage of the commercial life cycle. So yeah, I think it's really fascinating.
So what I would suggest, folks, is that we open up a discussion here. Sean, I can see your hand up, but feel free to do away with etiquette and let's chat through some of those themes that Warren has touched on there, and we'll use the rest of the time for that. See where we take it.
Thanks, Corey. Yeah, it was just one thing that I think I glossed over quite quickly in sharing what we learned through Contract Countdown. I think there was a really interesting additional role maybe that residents in particular could play for local authority procurement. One thing we heard was that even where social value has been embedded into the contract, the capacity doesn't always exist in a local authority to monitor that and to ensure that it's being delivered. And so that feels there's a risk there, I suppose. And it felt like there might be interesting roles for citizens to play, kind of aligned with the interests of the local authority to ensure that value for money is being secured and all of those commitments are being delivered. I think one barrier perhaps is around being able to get that information out into the public domain So yeah, I'm really looking forward to kind of understanding a bit better how the recent changes to the policy landscape might have created more opportunities for the sorts of stuff that we were exploring through that work. But essentially, just really interested in sort of transforming the relationship there. You know, not just councils are being cut to the bone, and I don't want to see them being kind of hammered for stuff that is beyond their control. I love the idea of citizens and their elected representatives being able to kind of work together to try and improve the situation.
I think you're absolutely, Sean. I think I really liked I think you called it, what do you call it? Climate twins. That's it. Yeah. Like, so you're kind of using data profiles to match different authorities from around the world, where actually you might find that there's an unexpected organization that you share a lot of similarities with. And so I think through projects like Keed, where we could be the broker of those relationships, to say, right, well, actually, if you've got a similar profile in terms of climate risk or adaptation or whatever the points on sustainable development might be, why don't you talk to each other to learn about what you're individually trying to do? There could be some opportunities to share, to reuse, to collaborate, so that you're not reinventing the wheel, and that you're actually helping to do something once that is likely to have repeatability across a number of different jurisdictions, and not being constrained by your local context to think, well, actually, particularly around like digital infrastructure or digital public goods that can be reused because they're open source and have multiple applications. And your example, I think, of the one of your services that are being used in multiple jurisdictions, I think there's a really important point around how modern approaches to technology, digital and data have a absolute reuse of value across and outside of the jurisdiction in which they're developed. So digital public goods infrastructure, but using community-based efforts to overcome kind of distance and time zones.
It occurs to me, both in what Warren was saying there and how you were presenting, that there is that grassroots movement that you were describing, Sean, in terms of the community, but also, Jen, from your work involving people in designing an open standard. So the people who will use the standard are the people who are involved in designing it. And it so happens a lot of the work that we have been doing is actually thinking about a similar thing for Keed in terms of creating a Keed standard, embryonic at the moment. But could you share any lessons from getting that engagement into the creation of an open data standard? And, what were the highlights, I suppose, as you went through that process?
Sure. So I suppose the key thing is the people you don't want to start with are the people who know about data standards. It is all about getting the people who know about whatever the domain is. So be that disaster risk reduction or be that contracting and procurement. And then convincing them that data is not scary before you then bring in the data people. So I suppose that's really all it is. It has been really interesting to see who gets involved. So particularly with the risk data stuff. So they'd already put together a steering group, which was made up of, there was some academics, there was some people from reinsurance companies, there was people from the World Bank, obviously. One group of people that did seem to sort of be missing was that more civil society, civic engagement, which I suppose makes a certain amount of sense because they are probably unlikely to be running these massive, large-scale models. But one project that the GFDRR were running alongside us developing this standard was they'd paid a load of data fellows in different countries to go out and collect data sets which they could then describe using the standard. And so they were having that direct engagement with local communities that were going to be affected by whatever disaster it would be in the countries that they were in. So, whether it's a tsunami or whether it's flooding or such. So that was really great. So then they were able to sort of feed back that information about the sort of data we should be collecting. And this is what the communities who are directly affected are actually concerned about and are actually needing to know. So it was almost sort of trying to link up all those different scales, because you've got, you know, the member of the public down there who's just trying to go about their everyday life, and they're aware that at some point, you know, maybe they live in a monsoon flood area and so it's going to affect them, but they don't really know how they can potentially do anything about that on a global level. And then you've sort of got all the way up to these massive multinational companies and groups like the World Bank who are trying to do some stuff towards it, but it's about how to link them together. So it was really interesting to see the route they took there of sort of getting researchers to sort of play that middle ground and try and link it all up, because it's a tough one. I think it's a really tough one to try and do.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I can see, Sean, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, it's so good to hear that work happened, because the thing that the dimension of this, I think you described around vulnerability, really made me think of, you know, that's a kind of a critical engagement to happen, to understand how people might be responding, how they've responded in the past, how they plan to respond in future, if they're planning, all that kind of stuff. It really reminds me, I don't know if people are familiar with this example. It's a wonderful example of trying to strengthen that capacity that is really sort of feeding into that neighborhood warmth work that I touched on earlier. So this kind of community-led home energy action, how do we enable that? And part of that is about putting communities in the driving seat of the just transition. You know, not having all of the benefits of that transition being extracted from an area, but keeping that wealth in the community, creating jobs locally to get this stuff done. And the example is, I think it was the city of San Francisco said that they would fund any street party, and the only requirement was that everybody was invited. So you'd have to invite everybody on your street. There's the money to do it. And the rationale was that the best, you know, because San Francisco is vulnerable to a number of different threats. So you can reinforce the buildings against earthquakes, but then a wildfire happens. So how do you kind of deal with all of those intersecting hazards? And yeah, the rationale was by inviting everybody on the street, you find out, you get to know people, you understand what their needs are, their capacity, so that an emergency hits, then you know that somebody might be, their mobility might be impaired and you need to prioritize getting them out of there, or there might be language barriers that you can start to overcome in advance of that kind of emergency happening. And I think it's also borne out by some of the data around tsunamis. I think in Japan, one of the recent tsunamis in Japan, I think there was a kind of really marked difference in how communities kind of weathered that based on the social capital in those places.
Yeah, thank you both. And it's interesting that you talk about that community planning and space. We were chatting just in the practice session about a talk I was doing up in Scotland, Jen, in Dundee at the Royal Town Planning Institute, and Scottish Government, as with Welsh Government, are putting such a focus on unlocking the data that sits behind planning, so that town planners are able to make better decisions, but also obviously with a link back to procurement, that is very much then procurement being enabled to go out, speak to the marketplace and find these innovative solutions that are peppered around, you know, that are coming from that grassroots side of things. So I think joining those dots is a really interesting conversation around climate adaptation and resilience. Warren, over to you. You've got your hand up just to get it for the last thoughts and reflections.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that, Corey, because I think what's very kind of, you know, Wales is leading in the sense that it's legislated for the well-being of future generations, alongside Scotland, Wales, New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, and Canada. These are national governments who are part of the Wellbeing Economies Alliance, and I think there's definitely something fundamental about like giving a voice to future generations who don't yet have, because they've not yet been born, they don't yet have an ability to feed into this. And I think there's that for me is like when we talk about kind of looking beyond our borders and thinking about a global community, our natural kind of first place to gravitate towards are like-minded governments who are thinking very differently about public value beyond traditionally in the economic dimension. And I think, yeah, there's definitely something there. I think, and also just, I'm glad you mentioned San Francisco. So California state recently, who are also part of the Wellbeing Economies Alliance, published policy toolkits on in order to apply intergenerational thinking into it. And I think there's a really interesting piece and fundamentally important piece around, how do we bring that kind of future voice into our current policy decisions, where we don't want to have, inadvertently have an unintended consequence for people who don't yet have a voice for that. So.
Well, the clock has just hit 3, so I will, in my role of timekeeper, draw our session to a close. I feel like for everybody, we could probably keep going on this, and maybe we'll have to have you both back in the future to talk through, because obviously this is a global challenge. It's not going anywhere, and it's been really fascinating to hear about how the open data standards, you've collaborated with them effectively, but also how you've linked that to procurement. I think that's such an important connection to have made, and seeing that being shared so generously. Thank you both for your work in that space. From us, I will draw that session to a close, and as usual, you can find out what's happening with our next Cydrannis coming up on the Cyd website. Thank you to our speakers, Jen and Sean, and I will say good afternoon, and thank you very much.